For the next panel, the main discussions we're looking at is actually going back to the speech that was just given in terms of trying to make CSR more effective and understanding how the collaboration can take place between the government and the corporates in order to achieve that goal. So for that, could I please call on to the panel Jitendra Kaira from Reliant Foundation, Deval Sangvi from Dasra, and Meeta Rajiv Lochin, the Directorate of the Municipal Administration, Mumbai. This panel will be moderated by Smarnita Shetty. And during the Q&A session, if you could just raise your hands, it might be easier for the people with the mics to be able to see.
Welcome everyone to the panel on increasing effectiveness of CSR. And I think it's a good extension of the conversation that we started the day with the Hard Talk in the morning, which kind of spoke about what is the role of corporates, what's the role of government in the whole sanitation program, right? So while this is not just focused on sanitation, but it is going to touch upon some of those aspects as well. And it's probably a good time to be talking about it today, 2 years after the CSR Act was passed. We've seen some activity, we've seen a lot of numbers around the money being thrown around. But I think what's also happening is people are realizing that problems in the social sector, whether it's health, education, livelihoods, can't be solved by just one stakeholder alone, right? So even if the corporates have the money, do they need to collaborate with other stakeholders, whether it's civil society, whether it's government? And on the other side, you'd wonder, why should government collaborate, right? Government has the clout, it has the money. But one of my colleagues, Nilima, actually shared some interesting statistics. She said that the Swachh Bharat mission requires a budget of 60,000 crores. Even if you looked at, say, and I think there's an allocation of, I should look at my numbers, sorry. The government of India has allocated 14,000 crores to this. The state governments would have allocated another 5,000, which leaves around 40,000 approximately. If you say private sector contribution, the contribution of the beneficiaries, that's still another half, which means 20,000 crores has to come from corporates. And 20,000 crores is a number every year that we think CSR is going to this, right? So it's a huge number. So which means that the government also requires money. It probably requires skill sets from the private sector. It would look at models and approaches that the private sector has. And so clearly there's a need for engagement between corporates and government. And I think to speak to some of that, we have Ms. Meeta, Jitendra, and Deval, in their capacity as a government official, as a corporate foundation, and as an intermediary facilitating some of this. So Meeta, if I could start with you, what's the role that you think, being a government official, what's the role that you think corporates can play, given their CSR mandate, and to kind of further the development agenda in the country?
Well, to that, I would like to say first, I'd like to talk about what are the two basic models of business, and from there I'll proceed to relate that to how I think CSR could be made more effective. Friends, as I see it, there's two models. One is that the businessman takes his money and he goes. There's an isolated interaction with the customer. Perhaps it could be a one-off project or a consultancy or building a road or something, and that's it. That's the extent of his engagement. But there is another model, a different model, in which businesses engage in a long-term perspective with their customers, with their clients. And it is this second model of business which I think is more appropriate when you talk about CSR. To give you an illustration, I'd like to take you back to the point where this company, Eureka Forbes, first launched the water purifier in the Indian market. And I remember Eureka Forbes spent a lot of time and money in sending their salesmen to different individual households, trying to convince people why they needed a water purifier. They were the first in the market, and their investment paid off. After that, I think the water sector never looked back, and water is big business in India today. But similarly, that is the kind of long-term perspective which we need when we look at governments, whether sanitation, education, health, anything. Governments have to stay engaged with their people, with their stakeholders over not just decades. They have to stay engaged with people over generations. And I think that is the model which works whether in business or in government the best if we are talking about creating value in the long term. Therefore, what I would say that yes, sure, whatever the figures which Manita shared about money, that's true, but money is only a small part of the problem. It's not the major part of the problem. It's the easiest thing in the world to write a check, but that simply isn't enough. By contributing money, you might be creating hardware. But unless we also look at the software that goes along with it, unless we take a holistic perspective, I can assure you from 25 years experience in government that the hardware won't remain either. I'll give you two simple examples. We just talked about Swachh Bharat in the morning session. And when we talk about composting wet waste, biomethanation plants are a treatment of choice. It's very simple, low-cost technology. I think it costs something like 10 lakh rupees per ton, and it simply converts wet waste into methane and then into electricity. It has been set up all over the country, throughout the state, throughout the country, but in most locations, that investment was never accompanied by any capability building and training people to run those plants. And the result is there to see for everyone. Very soon, very minor problems began to happen. Cracks would develop in the domes. The equipment would shut down after the first few years. And after that, since nobody had really been trained or no long-term engagement had happened, those plants were just so much deadwood. And the same is true whichever sector you look at. If you look at toilets, since we were talking about building toilets, it's not just writing a check for building a toilet block that's important. After all, when you look at a toilet, it is a mini sewage system. It requires in situ digestion, and therefore the design of your septic tank with which your toilet is connected is just as important. If it's not designed properly, then I shudder to think of the consequences 3 years down the line of so many poorly constructed toilets. Or even after the toilet is built, you need to maintain it. You need a good revenue model. Now, all these are things which are part of what I would call the software. In any project, you need both those components just as much. And for CSR to be effective, I think that's the kind of engagement which I personally would recommend. So then my recommendation would be, don't spread yourself out so thin on the ground. Perhaps you could, for entering into that kind of dialogue with stakeholders, you could adopt a few locations, perhaps a few villages, perhaps some townships, or if you can do a few wards in a town, just that much, that's fine. The size of the engagement is not important, it's the depth of the engagement which is important. We spend so much time in our public discourse talking about capital scarcity. Sure, India is a capital scarce country, but I think much more than capital, we require the mental ability to use those capital resources in an optimal manner. This is a lesson which the government has learned the hard way. Today, it's not so much just lack of resources, it's the lack of skills which plagues the government. And I do wish that the corporate sector doesn't learn the same lesson the hard way. Please learn from us and let's make the learning curve much better. It's very flat as of now.
Thank you, Meeta. And I think those are great points because it actually gives some direction to corporates saying that how do you engage, right? I think a lot of times when corporates sit on one side of the table, they're unable to know what's expected of them, and it's just great for, I think, people in the room to hear this. Jitendra, if I could come to you, I know you've been an IAS officer before, and now you're on the, the other side. Reliance is, one of the companies that actually exceeded its CSR mandate, right? So if you could share with the audience how you did that, and as part of that, did it involve engaging with the government to kind of achieve your CSR goals?
Yeah. So last year we actually were the biggest spender on the CSR. We spent more than 760 crores across the country and exceeded our 2% targets.
Can you hear him? Sorry.
Sorry?
No, I was just checking if they could hear. Okay, yeah.
I'm audible? Okay. So how did we do it? We did it. So we are a big team. We are close to 450 people spread across the country. We work in 14 states today. We have a big program on rural transformation. We work in more than 26 locations, more than 600 villages. And our boys on the ground, our people on the ground, stay in the villages, engage with the communities there, build people's platforms. They start looking at issues of water, issues of soil, issues of crops, productivity, and that's how sort of we start moving ahead. Out of the 600 villages, close to about 70 villages we have made water secure today from all perspectives, drinking perspective, agriculture perspective. By end of this March, another 40 will join this league. So these are kind of the things that we are engaged as far as rural transformation is concerned. Coming specifically to the collaboration with the government, I think we strongly believe that corporate foundations like ours have to work very closely with the government, but not for the reasons of the funds that you said. For example, you said there are not enough funds, therefore corporate should work with the governments. We don't believe that. See, look at the scenario of funds. I think we were in a Harvard program together. We were just counting the numbers. State governments and central government put together puts in more than 600,000 crores into the social schemes and social works. And the CSR monies are paltry 15,000 crores, 18,000 crores. Maybe it will touch 20,000 crores. So it is a very minuscule amount. So collaboration, if it was all around, give us money because government needs money, and that's what Meeta was also saying, it is no collaboration. I think essentially, I believe both the sides have their own strengths. Government has been in this game much, much longer than any one of us. Their feet on the ground, their knowledge about what works and what doesn't work is very intense. Some of us are new players in this game, and that's what she says. Probably there's so much to learn from some successes and some failures of the government, for sure. And on the other side, what corporate foundations like ours bring to the table is huge flexibility with which we can work, a spirit of innovativeness that we sort of bring on the ground. And there is this intent of bringing some of the best corporate practices, operational practices in the social space. It could be around M&E, measurement and evaluation. It could be around diagnostics. It could be about leveraging technology. Now, so there are strengths on this side, there are strengths on that side. I think with mutual respect for each other, there's so much more that we can do together. And that's sort of what has been our attempt. We've been in existence now for about 5 years as a foundation. Last 1 year, we have started seriously engaging with the government. First 4 years, we were sort of piloting our own ideas, learning from the government, learning on our own, dirtying our hands, so to say. And this year onwards, there are things that sort of we do jointly. Now, just to give you a few examples, the platforms that sort of we've been able to create in the villages, quite often we find that there are a lot of government schemes which can ride on those platforms, because there is this, governance mechanism which has got created. There is some kind of agglomeration of needs which has happened, and people have developed, communities have developed some kind of a capability to execute, and this I think government finds very useful, very productive to engage, and therefore a whole lot of schemes on sanitation, on water, on the agriculture side, on the energy side, for example. We've been able to sort of, people have come and in a way they are riding on all this. And then that's, I think, a win-win game for both the sides. Then I think a large number of places, we both act as technical partners to each other. So whatever little we have learned, we are very happy to get back to the government and say, look here, this is the model we believe will work. These softer elements seem to be missing in your schemes, which probably quite often is full of hard items, but softer elements sometimes are not to be seen. So, and similarly, there's so much that we learn from them in terms of execution, in terms of, the structures at the ground, dovetailing with the government, all that. So I think that's the model that at least at Reliance Foundation we are moving ahead with as I said earlier, mutual respect for what we have, both the sides, and then leveraging on each other. So.
Thanks. So it's interesting to hear how much mutual respect, both the government and corporate side, because that's not generally the refrain we hear. It's like, oh, we don't know how to work with government, and government is like, we don't know how to work with corporates. So I think there might be learnings, for the group here to kind of actually see some of the things that have worked, in both your cases. Deval, if I could ask you, as a non-government, non-corporate entity, as an outsider in a sense, what are the things that you've seen work, not work in some of the collaboration between government and corporates?
Sure, no, and I think, one of the big things that we've seen at Dasra over the last 16 years is that both groups, like Jitendra and I think Meeta had discussed, have extreme strengths. But at the same time, because they are very complementary in their approaches in terms of where one stops, the other one sort of starts, I think the issue comes in that many times when they're on the same table, it's difficult to find sort of that convergence or that alignment. And I think that's something that we've seen from Dasra's perspective, not only with just governments, and corporates, but also philanthropists and NGOs. Also within NGOs themselves, or within foundations themselves, and within government departments themselves. And so I think from an intermediary perspective, what we've seen is there's a need to sort of bring convergence together. And sometimes both groups, because they have such key strengths, at times they may not be able to find where those sort of convergence areas lie. And so Jitendra, I think, just referred to a program that we launched last year, and in fact announced here last year with the Harvard Business School, focusing on bringing corporates, government officials, as well as NGOs together to really learn off of the same platform where we had Professor Kasturi Rangan from the Harvard Business School coming and talking to these three groups as one to really figure out how strategic CSR can create greater impact and how it's very similar to whether it's government policies. So we had the individual who was running, or is currently running, Samir, who's running Swachh Bharat in Maharashtra, alongside with individuals from Reliance Foundation and others, and Shelter Associates and other organizations working in sanitation in different sectors. And so I think there's a real need to bring these three groups together to help them realize where there are places of convergence, and then helping to sort of be that glue. And so in most of the research we've seen in terms of collaboration and alliances, whether it's through multi-stakeholder groups or even through stakeholders within the same audience, there is this need for somebody to facilitate that conversation and be there for the long run, as Meeta was saying, because otherwise these quick sort of investments, because government sometimes have 5-year terms or less. Corporates also, the individuals that you're working with may or may not be at the same company 6 months from now. And so having somebody who's there for the long run, I think, is really critical.
Thanks. And I wanted to go back to, how both of you, all three of you are speaking about, things that are working. So if you could give us examples of some of the successful collaborations, I think from each one of your perspectives, that would be really helpful, because it also gives us a sense of what were the triggers and what worked in those cases.
So, two recent examples in the past 1 year, two companies had approached us. One was the New India Assurance Company, it's an insurance company, and General Insurance Corporation, again insurance, and they were looking for progressive urban local bodies with whom they could work. Both were interested in the theme of sanitation, and we were able to put them in touch with some very responsible bodies which have a responsible political leadership, and they gave them the first question which the corporations asked the bodies was, what is it that you would like to do? See, that is a question that is not always asked, although it seems very self-evident, it is not so self-evident. So they gave them a bouquet of choices, that either a community toilet or a local garden or some waste processing plant or even a tourist site. And then the company made a choice that this is the project which we would like to fund, and they set up a stakeholders committee where the projects would be reviewed regularly by representatives of the company and by representatives of the local body. That way the corporation got to know how decision making was being made. And I think that in CSR projects that's very important. What are the kind of projects to take? And interestingly enough, they then adopted 4 villages, and they have committed that they will give 25 lakhs to each village for the next 4 years. These were small towns. And interestingly enough, one of these insurance companies, they were also able to persuade the local body to fund a health insurance scheme for their employees. So some areas of convergence and which gel with their specific domains also work out. But for all that to happen, I think it's this process of dialogue which is very important. At least it worked in both these cases.
Jitendra, some examples of successful collaboration.
Many examples. So, but okay. So maybe I want to reflect on what makes for a successful collaboration between two sides and what does not. So one is, earlier I was with the Dr. Reddy's Foundation, and we were again collaborating with the government. What didn't work in some of the cases was when we were a vendor to the government, when we became a vendor to the government, when for our services government was paying, in most cases it did not work. Let me be honest about it. So, so I don't know. I think there are some good examples today for sure. For example, the NSDC, the last collaborations that we had with the NSDC, the National Skill Development Corporation, the payment mechanisms have really evolved over a period of time. Today you can actually upload your documents, and whole thing is so automatic, so to say, that the money flows. But in large number of places it does not. And that's very frustrating for a collaborator on the other side, because one can keep talking big things, but if the money doesn't come, then the whole thing is lost. So at least one learning we picked up as a partner on the other side was, bring your own money if you want to collaborate with the government. If you want to depend on government's money, you would lose the game somewhere or the other. Having said that, so what greatly works is that I think these kind of technical partnerships, where if initially there's enough investment from both the sides on understanding what each partner will bring to the table, and quite often it is the softer elements which the corporate entity or the foundation can sort of bring to a scheme, bring to the table there. So I think that's really succeeded for us. So government has very good plans, government can back it with money, government can back it with mandate, but quite often smaller elements here, there, and they are softer elements, so to say, they somehow, the government is not able to take care of them. And government says no. See, so another aspect perhaps to add to this would be, quite often in the schemes of the government, community is not at the centrality. The beneficiaries are not at the centrality of the whole thing. So that's another softer part, which I think as a corporate entity, if you are able to advise, bring in, work upon, I think then the whole thing works beautifully together. So at least in my own experience, the softer elements and centrality of the community, of the beneficiaries, if two things the corporates can bring in and government can back it with their big schemes, big plans, big machinery that they have, I think the whole thing can work together. And of course, you've got to get your money. Yeah. That's what I believe.
It's interesting. I think I'm going to start using the hardware and software terminology now, because that's what you referred to as earlier, and that's what you're saying as well, right? In addition to the actual hardware, you need the softer skills, the software to make some of this work and some of these collaborations work. I have a couple of more questions, but I'm sure the audience has a few questions as well. And so I'll throw it open to the audience, and then if we don't have enough, we can come back to the panel. Like Krishna mentioned, if people can put up their hands, yeah. Sure.
So I'm Pawan Sawant from Muktangan Education. I have a question, or rather a suggestion, not very related to the topic that's been discussed, but for the corporates, since a lot of corporate people are here. So I spent some 20 years in the corporate world and have taken a conscious decision to move to the social development sector. Now corporates have two resources. One is money, the second is people. My personal view is that, and a lot of people have said that to me, is that the people in the organization should get chance to go to the social sector, because a lot of them want to. So like we have this 2% policy now for CSR, can we have a dedicated time from every employee, which can be like say 2%, not mandated, but at least you'll get a good chunk of people coming to the field, understanding the problems that our country faces in the social sector, and then maybe that gives a lot of impetus to this social development. So that's just a suggestion. Maybe our corporates working on that. Is that something? Maybe I heard of an Infosys doing something on this. But can large organizations think on these lines?
Jitendra, yeah.
So yes, I think that's a great suggestion. Most of the corporates are beginning to develop their own volunteering policies, you know. But I think what you're essentially talking of is a long-term engagement, maybe 6 months, maybe 9 months, maybe a year. So, but we are yet to see those kind of policies get grounded in the corporates. I'm aware IBM has a policy where interns come for about a year. We had interns at Dr. Reddy's Foundation from IBM for some time. But not many corporates have this. But I'm sure that's the direction for all of us to move in. In a small way, we have started this at Reliance, where 3 months projects, we engage the employees of the principal company. They come and spend time with us, sometimes on the M&E side, sometimes on the development of the small softwares, you know, HR issues. But this is a small beginning, and I think all of us have to travel a long way in this. But this is something that we all must sort of move on. I agree with that.
Yeah.
Thank you for the discussion. You know, I quite understand the fact that some collaborations succeed, but I think, and I want the panelists to comment on it, I think it all boils down to individuals at the end. If I have a district collector, or if I have a block development officer who is very passionate about certain things, and you know, he connects well with my plant manager, you know, there is a very good example of collaboration taking place. It cannot be institutionalized. The same thing doesn't happen elsewhere. So somewhere I think we need to understand it and see how to institutionalize collaboration. I think that's a very big challenge.
Actually, I would like to respond to that. I would say that yes, it can be structured, it can be institutionalized if there are two organizations talking to each other. I think in India we are much more culturally attuned to individual activity, and we are much less sensitive to organizational values and organizational cultures. When I talk about facilitating a dialogue, I mean a dialogue between a local body, an elected leadership of an urban local body, and between whatever group that you wish to set up to interact with them. See, local bodies, whether urban or rural, they are stakeholders. They are there to stay. I am doubtful about a partnership where you identify a government officer as a key stakeholder. We might facilitate the terms of the dialogue. We are not there to stay. Government officers stay there 2 years, 3 years, they move out. You need to conduct a dialogue with the local community. No? They are the ones to whom it matters whether your project succeeds or fails. So a good comment officer can make a difference by helping, but you cannot base a project on his or her existence. You have to engage in a dialogue with the local community. So I agree with Jitendra with that.
Yeah. Anyone else?
Hi. I'm Ajit. I'm independent. Any business strategy if you follow the normal MO, you have an objective, you have a strategy, with it comes a structure, and part of the structure is organizational structure, which requires certain skill sets. It really doesn't matter where those skill sets come from, government, corporate, or wherever. Okay, the key is it has to be customer-centric, in which case you're talking about community. So what does it matter where that skill sets come from, as long as they're put together? But the person who's going to put them together is called the leader. And like this gentleman suggested, sometimes the plant manager or something gets together. Government bodies, corporate bodies are not leaders. It requires a leader to bring them together. Where do you find such leaders?
So every elected body has a set of local leaders. He may not see eye to eye with your goals, okay? Then it's your job to go and establish congruence. But for you or anyone else to say that there is a political vacuum over there, nothing could be further from the truth. Do you think there's no mayor and no councillors in the Brihan Mumbai Mahanagarpalika? Sure they are. You may not agree with their goals. That's a different thing. Then you need to seek convergence between what they seek and what we seek. I'll just give you an illustration. See, most of the time our problem in the sanitation campaign has been that the outcomes are not always tangible. A cleaner city is not such a tangible outcome. And political leaders often don't see it as a value. They will say, if I build a water supply scheme, I can go and ask for votes. If I build a road, I can go and ask for votes. But madam, you tell me, go and clean up the city. How does that mean that I will get more votes? I don't think so. So that is the point at which you have to work. Even in a business, some of the most important value, long-term value which a business creates is goodwill and brand value. Is it not? Everyone understands that. See, there's leadership, where it is very condescending to say that there is no leadership. You have to talk to them and find a common area. That would be my suggestion to you.
And maybe if I can, sir, add to this, there are areas where initially you spot lack of leadership. So as we walked into the villages, for example, it occurred as if nobody is interested in development, nobody is interested in discussion of these issues. And that's where our skills are used for investing into creation of a leadership. So, but intention is very clear. Let skills of the government, let skills of the corporate, and maybe our joint money be run by the community taking the lead. And some of them will emerge as leaders as long as we continue to invest there. So as Meeta says, maybe we'll have to invest into further leadership development of the political leadership perhaps in some point of time, in some places, and in some places the community leaders will have to, we will have to sort of push them to take that role. We'll have to train them, we'll have to expose them, and then let them lead it. But surely there's no dearth of, as long as we are committed to this concept, the leadership emerges. That's at least our experience in this space.
For us to just realize that, and I think the last speaker was a perfect example of this, and that's why we have a few of the nonprofits in the room that have been supported by the Gates Foundation. These organizations have been working in the same community for a number of years. They haven't been transferred because of political reasons or because of business reasons. And I think that's why the critical piece, which is sometimes missing in these conversations, is the role of civil society actors. And I think these civil society actors, the fact that they're from the communities, that the fact that they've been there, that they inherently, their role, regardless of whether they focus on education, health, or sanitation, their role inherently, if they're good, is to create leaders within the community to demand what's rightfully theirs from whomever they should get it from, whether it's government, the corporate sector, philanthropists, civil society, etc. And so I think that's why the civil society plays a critical role, because their business, so to speak, is to build leadership within the communities that they serve and provide them the opportunities and the connections required for them to demand high-quality services, which unfortunately market-driven solutions and the government may not be providing at this date. And so I think it's critical to have those partners and trust these organizations, because no one else has a stronger sense of the community than they do, and the leaders that have emerged from these organizations are again from that same community that we're trying to serve.
And we just met one, just
exactly.
Before us.
Krishna Ben.
Just met one, yeah.
Yes, so if I could ask each one of the panelists, if there was one ask that you had, and Meeta, if you had like one thing to ask of corporates and of civil society to kind of make some of these issues more addressable, as in, whether it's health or sanitation, education, actually make the needle move on this, what would it be? And similarly, Jitendra, if you could ask civil society and the government, and Deval, if you could ask government and corporates, what would that one thing be that you would ask of them to make sure that some of these issues are addressed or, can never be resolved?
I would say that every corporate should choose whatever domain area is best suited to synergize with whatever their core business is. And once they have chosen that, after that, then they should select any small community and engage with them in the long term. They should engage in creating value in the long term. And I'm sure that whatever X money they invest, it will come back 10X to them. But it has to be a serious engagement. You have to talk to people. You have to understand and address their concerns and find common ground. There's no difference between making a business project work, ma'am, and between making a CSR project work. So you have to get things going on the ground.
Okay, so what do I ask of the government?
Yes.
Okay, that's interesting. Listen more.
Deval?
So they have to listen more, yeah, that's it.
I think from all sides, honestly, it's being more open and finding that place of convergence. And I think for the philanthropists in the room and the corporates in the room, I think to realize that it's worth to invest in that time it takes to build those partnerships. And I think we're all saying it's not about the amount of funds that are lacking, for example, in the sector. It's about how these three groups haven't come together. And to be honest with you, very few people want to fund it. And so many of the corporates that are in this room, I know Dasra has worked with extensively, and the conversations when it comes to actually funding what it takes to partner and finding that basis of understanding, that's when most corporates say, oh, well, we can't do that. We need to fund something that we can tell our board is tangible. And I think from that perspective, we've been very, very fortunate to have support from BMGF now to really build some of these partnerships, first with their NGO portfolios, and then really take it out to corporates, to government, et cetera, because I think the investment required to create these long-lasting partnerships, which go in depth, sometimes last a couple of years, but hopefully if you do it right, they will far sustain any of the CSR laws or the government officials that are there for a 2 or 3 year period.
Just one last thing I would like to say, see, government very often in our funding structures, we don't really, are not geared towards rewarding communities which perform better. It's all very tied down per head population, per this, per that. And I think in order to build an ecosystem where merit is recognized, we do need to recognize and reward communities which work well. So if anyone is interested in instituting a small kind of prize, this is the goal in mind, and if any community is able to work towards this goal, this is the kind of prize money which I or my organization is willing to offer, that would go a long way. Otherwise, most of our programs are simply geared to the lowest common denominator. So prizes for good performing communities, I think that would be a very great plus.
Right, yeah. That's an extremely interesting point, right? Actually foster innovation, foster community development, and actually reward for some of that behavior. Are there any more questions? Okay, so it's going to be difficult to summarize because there have been really interesting points that have been raised. But I think it's been interesting to get the perspective of the government as well as the corporate as well as a facilitator, on the same panel. And what's been interesting is that everyone agrees that you don't just come at it with, say, the money, right? Or with like the building of toilets or just the hardware. There are learnings from each other on the softer sides of things, right? Are there models that work? Does the private sector do innovation that can then be like brought into the system? Can you make the community and the people at the center of everything? And also, is there a need to facilitate some of these conversations because traditionally these stakeholders might not have spoken to each other, right? So getting them in the same room, having them talk to each other, getting them to understand the other person's point of view, the whole listening more, working together more, is probably a step towards having more effective collaboration and more effective CSR. And with that, I'd like to thank all our panelists and thank you so much for this.
Thank you.